The soaring price of oil has forced unquestionable changes on the U.S. economy. Americans are behaving differently. They're driving and flying less. They're investing in green and renewable energy technology. But can we really change the way we power our lives anytime soon? Next on Great Decisions.
In a democracy, agreement is not essential, but participation is. Join us as we discuss today's most critical global issues. Join us for Great Decisions. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association, inspiring Americans to learn more about the world.
Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation. Great Decisions is produced in association with the University of Delaware.
When the Hummers first hit the streets in the 1990s, they were a sensation. It was the height of the SUV era, and these were the biggest and baddest gas guzzlers of them all. But now, little more than a decade later, General Motors is dumping the Hummer brand. With gasoline at $4 a gallon, sales of giant cars and trucks are plunging. Since 2002, oil prices have steadily increased, from $20 a barrel to nearly $150 a barrel in the summer of 2008. And it's not just oil. In the past decade, natural gas prices have more than tripled. Even Appalachian coal costs 5 times what it did a decade ago. All of this means energy prices are going up for the average American. And in the U.S., which imports much of its fuel, the buzzword is energy independence.
Whenever you hear a politician say energy independence, run for the hills, because either they're ignorant or they're disingenuous.
60% of the crude oil used in the U.S. is imported from countries like Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and Russia, governments with which the United States doesn't always see eye to eye. And we're not the only country thirsty for their resources. China, India, and other developing countries have growing energy needs too, driving up demand, prices, and oil's carbon-producing impact on the environment. Americans have now begun to look for new solutions, some of them homegrown: offshore drilling, tax incentives to encourage investment in biofuels, and nuclear, wind, and solar energy projects to get away from oil.
Energy is a $6 trillion a year business globally. Over the next couple of decades, somewhere between 10 and 40 years, we're going to totally remake that energy world.
But what are the risks of these new energy sources, and the costs? How likely are they to break America's oil dependency? Off the Grid, Energy and the U.S. Economy, coming up next on Great Decisions.
And now from our studios, here is Ralph Begleiter.
Welcome to Great Decisions. I'm Ralph Begleiter. Joining me to discuss energy and its impact on the economy are Nathaniel Green, Director of Renewable Energy Policy at the Natural Resources Defense Council, and Nat Cohan, Environmental Defense Fund's Director of Economic Policy and Analysis. Thank you both for being with us on Great Decisions. Nathaniel, I think it's fair to say that people see two kind of prongs to this issue of energy independence. On the one hand, producing more energy so you can deal with the short term. On the other hand, cutting back consumption so you can face the long-term future. How do you see that?
Well, that's exactly right. There are two sides and they're intimately linked. It's the demand and the supply, and we need to manage both. And we really see the demand and reducing demand, making it efficient as possible as the fastest, cheapest, and cleanest way to free up supply so that we can keep growing our economy, building our economy up. And it also gives us time by investing in efficiency and making our demand as efficient as possible. It gives us time to build out the new technologies, to act in a really aggressive way to get these new technologies out there on the supply side so that they keep going forward in a balanced way.
Nat?
Well, I think that's right, and just to build on what Nathaniel said, I think there are 3 ways to get out of this. One is to try and expand the supply of fossil fuels. But if we try to drill our way out of this, it's not going to work. The U.S. just has 3% of the world's oil reserves, and we consume 20%. So that's not going to get us there. Option 2 is to use less energy, and Nathaniel was just talking about that, and that's an important piece of the puzzle. But the third option is something we also have to pursue, and that's finding new sources of energy other than fossil fuels and that will help solve the climate problem, and it also put our economy on a new path.
I think it's fair to say that at least since the 1970s, mid-70s or so, American presidents have been calling for energy independence. So it's been 30-plus years now that that's been going on. Democrats and Republicans, by the way. It's a recurring buzzword these days, too, which is demonstrated, I think, by some of the other experts that we talked to at Great Decisions. Let's listen to what they had to say.
It is estimated that the oil reserves and the natural gas reserves in the areas offshore Alaska are as great there as they are in any other part of the Arctic. They're assessing that approximately 20 to 25% of the world's remaining reserves of oil and natural gas are in the Arctic. That's at our fingertips, literally, if we can use our technology to help advance that.
I think the truth is, as long as we're dependent on overseas oil, we're not in control of our own fate. And that's really what's fundamentally unacceptable over time. And we have an alternative, and it's really to focus on innovation, to drive our economy towards a new energy future, and to do much more with innovation and technology development. And frankly, what Saudi Arabia is to oil, America is to innovation.
Realistically, we have to think about energy interdependence. And ultimately, until we get off of oil, if we use even a drop of oil, wherever it comes from, we're not independent because every barrel of oil is connected to every other in a fungible global commodity market. So drilling in Alaska, not that I'm against it or for it, but let's put it in perspective. It won't give us energy independence.
Nat, let me ask you first. Senator Murkowski said the oil in Alaska is at our fingertips. Is that a fair description of how easy it would be to extract that energy for use in the United States and perhaps elsewhere?
I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration, and now Senator Murkowski is representing her constituents of Alaska. But that oil is not going to come online right away. Even the oil on the north slope of Alaska will, expanding that resource will take time. I want to pick up on one of the ironies here, which is that accessing the oil down at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean only gets easier as the Arctic sea ice melts. And this is a great example of a feedback effect. The only way we're going to get there is because we're warming the planet fast enough that the ice is melting, and now we want to go and burn more oil from there, which is only going to worsen the problem. So I think there's an irony in there about the Arctic oil.
Nathaniel, is energy independence, that buzz phrase, is that illusory?
The oil market is really an international market, and so Vijay's point is absolutely technically correct. As long as you're consuming it, whether it comes, we drill it here, or the Saudis drill it over there, we're going to be vulnerable to the price of oil, the international price of oil. And so I think talking about energy security is a much more meaningful frame. We want to protect ourselves from the volatility in the international energy markets as much as we can. And that means diversifying our supply and really investing in the technologies that aren't interlinked with the supply of fossil fuels around the world. And that's the renewable energy technology.
Now, I'm not an expert at this topic, but I think that even if you start looking at alternative sources of energy, wind, solar, and so on, sea power, waves, and so on, eventually, if there's an international grid, aren't all these energy sources going to be fungible, and you're going to see energy flowing from one country to another country, particularly in places where geography lends itself that way?
We don't have an international energy grid, and that's a ways off. So there is just a geographic security in our isolation, if you think about a continent as being isolated. But economically, there is going to be, especially as we use more electricity in the transportation sector, that will start to connect the electric markets with the oil markets a little bit more. But still, the fact that renewable energy technologies are, you don't pay for the fuel. The fuel is blowing in the wind, coming from the sun, makes their costs very stable. And so that will help, take volatility out of those energy markets.
I just want to add one quick thing, which is that the best way to protect ourselves from volatility is to diversify our energy needs, okay? Right now, we depend enormously on imported oil and on natural gas. which
Diversify the sources, not the needs.
Exactly. Thank you. Diversify the sources of our energy. And so that's what investing in renewables and wind and solar and biofuels will help us do. It's not just having domestically grown sources of energy, although that's important. It's more having a diversified range of sources so that we're not tied to one particular dictator or cartel or one particular market.
Speaking of being tied to a particular dictator or a particular political leader, put yourselves in the shoes of a political leader for a moment. You've got to make decisions on these important policy issues. Where do you get your energy? How quickly can you get it? What are the demands being made by your constituents who vote for you and will either re-elect you or won't re-elect you? Don't you have to think of these problems in a much shorter term frame than both of you are talking about it this way? You're talking about thinking about long-term future here, but politicians are on short-term leashes in terms of their elections, aren't they?
Oh, well, I mean, I want to emphasize something that Nat said earlier, which is that the short-term solution is energy efficiency. If you want to reduce people's pain at the pump, you want them to get into a more efficient vehicle. You want to help teach them, you know, whether it's blowing up their tires more, or tuning up their engines, things that they can do with their cars that they have now, but also make sure that the next car that they buy is a much more efficient car so that they can pay less at the pump. So demand first and foremost. And then the other thing, I think, is you want to get people back to work, and you want to get people back to work in really good jobs. And the key is getting people back to work in good jobs, doing good for our energy and our economy. And I think growing this whole clean energy sector is a huge area of investment.
Who's going to provide the capital for growing that sector? Isn't it going to be the energy firms themselves in some measure anyway? Maybe even in large measure?
Well, I absolutely, yeah, they've got to be part of it. I mean, the private sector is going to drive this whole investment in this area, drive the innovation, deploy the technology. But you know, with the economy softening, the government's going to have less tax dollars to drive these sort of investments, and with the credit markets tightening up, the private sector is going to not be able to borrow as much money to make these sort of investments themselves. So we really need to look towards a new set of tools if we want to move our economy forward in this area. And I think that's where climate legislation really comes in. Because when you cap the amount of greenhouse gas pollution we can put into the atmosphere, you basically create credits and a value to each ton of pollution we put in the atmosphere. We can then auction those off and really create a pot of gold that we can use to drive investment in these new technologies, put people back to work, deploying these technologies, and really give ourselves the tools to move forward.
I want to pick up on that because this is going to be driven by private investment. The market and the private market, that's where the funds are going to come from. That's where the R&D needs to take place. That's what the market does really well. So innovation is going to be powered by the market, but we won't get there by the market alone, because to give firms the incentive to do those innovations, to invest that money, and to ultimately adopt those new technologies, we've got to put a cap on carbon. I'll just give you an example. California is a leader here, and California has passed legislation to cap California's emissions. We have seen a 10-fold increase since 2002. From 2002 to 2007, a 10-fold increase in clean tech investment, in venture capital investment going into new technologies for new low-carbon pathways. That's what we'll see if we put a cap on the U.S. emissions.
Some of our other great decisions experts agree with both of you that there are a lot of incentives out there to move people and governments and corporations in the direction of seeking alternative sources. Let's hear what they have to say.
We must be realistic about the future of our energy needs in recognizing that the future is not necessarily fossilized fuels. It's the renewables, it's the alternatives, it's what can come to us from the wind, from solar, from geothermal, from ocean energy. there's so much potential that is out there, and I think we recognize that. We've got to move to that next generation.
You've got lots of entrepreneurial activities, small startup businesses trying out the widest imaginable array of alternative energy sources, from geothermal power to wind power, solar power, then people trying to do quite exotic things like extract fuel from algae. And at the same time, some of our big, long-standing companies have stepped up and decided they can become environmental goods and services providers. But to really lock that in and to create the incentives for deep investment and real commitment over time, we have to have a framework of regulations that provide a signal to the private sector that investments here will pay off.
There's now an emerging bipartisan consensus that we need to have prices on carbon. This will be the single most important change in environmental policymaking in a generation.
Now, Nathaniel, you already talked about that a little bit. I'd like to pursue that a little bit further, that last point. Putting a price on carbon. In the everyday world, what does that mean to somebody driving a Hummer or an SUV up to a gas station? Are they going to have to switch cars? Are they going to be paying a tax, in effect, for using carbon-based products? Nat?
Well, let me start by saying and I'll get to the point about the costs, but I want to agree with Vijay on the need for policies, but add an extra point, which is, yes, you need a price on carbon, but you also need a cap on carbon dioxide emissions and on emissions of other greenhouse gases. Just having a price, just having a tax, since we don't know where to set it, that's not going to be enough. So you have to have a cap, and then you use a market under that cap to drive innovation forward. And that market in allowances, in emissions, will create a price. This is something we've done to solve acid rain with a great deal of success. So we know how to do it, and when you do that, you are going to raise energy costs, certainly in the short run. The whole problem we face is we're burning too much fossil fuel, too great a volume, and so we need to change people's behavior. But the effect is not going to be as great as you hear some places. So, for example, at the pump, if we had passed the legislation last year in the Senate, the Lieberman-Warner legislation, that would have raised gasoline prices just about 2 cents a gallon over the next 20 years or so, according to estimates. That is tiny relative to the kind of swings we've seen just because of geopolitics. The total cost for a household, if you put it in comparison with the average dollar an American household receives, we're talking less than a penny on the dollar for an American household to solve this problem. So it's not going to be free, but it's not going to break the economy. In fact, it's going to be affordable. In return, we get to invest in the next generation of low-carbon technologies, the next wave of the American economy.
Go ahead. And I think the other thing that's really important to recognize is that it's easy to get caught up, how much more will a gallon of gasoline cost? How much more will a kilowatt hour of electricity cost? But most of us don't really pay attention to that. We pay attention to how much it costs to fill up my tank, or how much does it cost to light my electric bill at the end of the month. And by investing back in these the demand side technologies and bringing down the cost of the renewable energy technologies, the bill that we pay at the end of the month, which is really what matters to us when we try to balance our budgets, that's going to be much smaller. And in fact, for many of us, can go down. You get into a more efficient car, a 2-cent increase in the gallon of gas is going to get lost in the fact that if you're driving, say, a 100 mile per gallon car, you're not going to notice that 2 cents. You're going to see a lower bill.
I don't know if it's fair to ask you both this, but I'm going to throw it out anyway here. Let's try to enumerate how people would see the changes taking place in this country if you had a cap and a price on carbon, the one you've just been talking about. Would we see the government investing in mass transit? Would we see all the automakers effectively overnight starting to churn out the 100 per gallon cars that you were just talking about? What actual changes would we see take place, and how much of a time frame will that take to unfold? Nat?
So right away, you'd see a number of things that businesses and electric power plants can do to operate more efficiently. There are things they can do to improve the efficiency of their boilers. There are things businesses and households can do to reduce their energy consumption without affecting their standard of living. It's just reducing energy consumption on the margin. So right away, you have some ways to reduce our energy consumption and get started. And then when you put that cap on carbon, like Nathaniel said, this is effectively creating a pot of gold for innovators and entrepreneurs to develop the next set of low-carbon technologies, the next set of energy technologies that Dan Esty was talking about. And when you unleash the power of that entrepreneurship, that's going to generate the long-term solutions we need to get the deep reductions we need over the next several decades.
How long does that take out? Several decades it takes?
Well, I'm saying we need to be on a downward path starting now and continuing over the next several decades. How long that takes? Well, some of those things might just take a couple of years. Some of the big, Dan Esty was talking about algae that generate diesel fuel. That's early in the stage, but there's a lot of capital going into that, and that would get jump-started by an investment that you would see from the cap. I also, though, we know how to build wind turbines, and we're building more and more of them, but a cap on carbon, a price on carbon, is the best way, again, to jump-start that set of issues. So we have things we can do today, we have things we can start building today, and we have technologies that will come to flower and to fruition over the next 10 and 20 years.
Go ahead, Nathaniel. Yeah, I mean, I would just add that it is another really critical part of the whole carbon cap and invest idea is that you send a signal to the market that where we're headed in the long term. And so for a lot of us, if we live in a suburban community, we may not be near a mass transit line, and it just might not make sense economically to bring a mass transit line out to us. But as we send a signal to the marketplace, and so we start driving less, and we want to live in communities where we're closer to the supermarket, closer to our job, suddenly these things like mass transit, more train lines, more bus lines become more economically feasible. So the sort of infrastructure investments that are also critical to making life easier under a carbon constraint become more economic over time.
We actually are seeing in the United States now experiments on the West Coast and on the East Coast in New England. There are some experiments with this carbon trading system that you've been talking about. One of the other factors that plays in here is the fact that the United States chose not to be a big player in the Kyoto climate change agreement over the last decade or so, and people are moving on beyond that now. Let's look at what some of our experts have said about the international governance on this issue of climate change and energy.
So the critical way forward involves re-engaging the world and really reasserting the principle that has been at the center of every successful global environmental effort, and that's the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. Common meaning every country steps up to obligations, and it was a huge mistake in Kyoto not to ask everyone to do something. Differentiated meaning, of course, that countries are going to have different levels of obligation.
We're about to enter a post-Kyoto world, and I think that's a good thing. There's been too much energy dissipated fighting over the Kyoto Protocol on both sides of the Atlantic. But let's be clear, international cooperation is important, but meaningful action will come from the bottom up, in countries, in localities, and by actions of individuals.
Now, many countries, including the United States in a way, have moved beyond Kyoto at this point. They began in Bali, Indonesia. Talk to me a little bit about what the pillars will be in your mind, not the details necessarily, of a new format for international governance on climate change and energy issues. What will we be fundamentally talking about?
Well, I think the starting point has to be the U.S. taking leadership. Because right now, Dan Esty talked about engaging the world, but the world is trying to engage us, the U.S., and we haven't done anything. And we need to take leadership. We need to have national climate legislation. That will give us the moral authority and the standing to say, okay, we've taken on commitments. Now let's design a system that has, like Nathaniel said, binding commitments on all countries eventually, not right away, but binding caps on emissions from everyone. That's not a very popular, in some ways, popular position, but you have to do it to solve this problem. So then you have to say, well, we need to do that in a way that allows developing countries like China and India to grow. What we need to do, you talk about the pillars of a system, we need to create an international agreement that attracts people into the system. Think of the World Trade Organization. That's a club everyone wants to be a member of. So we need to create a climate agreement and a climate framework that brings people in and that makes countries want to join. And the way to do that, again, is going to be with a carbon market. We're going to have to build a carbon market block by block, country by country, and when we do that, that will be the attractor, that will be the magnet that will pull countries in. We will solve this problem when the 30 top Indian businessmen go to the Prime Minister of India and say, why aren't you accepting a cap so that we can have access to the US carbon market, to the EU carbon market? We want a cap on our emissions so we can access that money. That's when we'll solve the problem. We've been talking a lot about energy, about infrastructure, about developing the U.S. economy, but I want to bring us back to what I see as the driver of all of this. We haven't spent a lot of time or had the time to talk about what will happen if we don't do anything. If we keep on our current course, if we keep burning fossil fuels, we are cooking the planet. This is not, and we think this sounds like a long-term problem. This is not a long-term problem. It is a long-term problem, but it's also a short-term problem. We already see the Arctic sea ice melting. We already see signs of the Antarctic ice sheet and the Greenland ice sheet melting. Many of the catastrophic consequences will start happening in 30 or 40 years. That's when my kids will be my age. That's not the long term. That feels like the short term.
Nat Cohan, Environmental Defense Fund's Director of Economic Policy and Analysis, and Nathaniel Green, Director of Renewable Energy Policy for the Natural Resources Defense Council. Thank you both for being with us on Great Decisions.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ralph.
And thank you as well for watching Great Decisions. We'll see you next time. I'm Ralph Begleiter.
To learn more about topics discussed on Great Decisions, visit our website at www.greatdecisions.tv. To order a copy of the Great Decisions Briefing Book, a DVD set of this series, or join a Great Decisions discussion group in your area, contact the Foreign Policy Association. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation. Great Decisions is produced in association with the University of Delaware.
Next time on Great Decisions. The United States has been the world's dominant power since the Second World War, but today there are new economic challengers: Brazil, Russia, India, and especially China. Does a faltering U.S. economy compromise its role as the world's only superpower? Next time on Great Decisions.